Good morning, my friends. It's an honor to be with your community again, and I'm just grateful to be back. Let's begin, as I always do everywhere I go, with us sharing in three full deep breaths together. So, if you will, breathe everything out and take a deep breath in and let go. And take another deep breath in and let go. And then take one more full breath in and letting go. And so this morning, it is 4th of July weekend, and so happy Independence Day. I want to explore this idea of freedom. I want to explore this idea of what do we mean by the word freedom? What is it as a God quality? What does it mean to us as people in New Thought? And what does it perhaps mean to us as a nation and as sort of a collective consciousness? So I want to just start with some definitions that I found. I just Googled the word freedom, or what is freedom, and the first thing that Google told me is that freedom is the power or right to act, speak, or think as one wants, without hindrance or restraint. And I think that in a big way, that really points to our definition of freedom that we think about in Science of Mind as we talk about our personal freedom and our creative freedom, and that we have the power to change our thinking and change our lives. That each one of us has the power, the right to act and to speak and to think as we want. That, last month we talked about this idea of mindfulness for mavericks, that we are in New Thought, that we are unorthodox and independent thinking people, that we have the right to think and to speak and to act based on the ideas that live and breathe within us and how we identify ourselves and what we want and how we want to live in the world. And that's kind of, in a way, the Science of Mind philosophy has really focused on this sort of idea of freedom, that each one of us has this indwelling freedom that lives within us that is seeking to be expressed through our life. The second definition that Google gave me, that freedom is the state of not being imprisoned or enslaved. Now, it's almost kind of the opposite of that first definition in a sense. It's, the first definition is the idea that freedom is our ability to freely move and to live and to breathe and to have our being in the way that we want. But this second definition is about not being imprisoned, not being held in place, not having that sense of freedom being restrained. And this definition of freedom, I think, is in a big way what we've been talking about on a national level as we've been having this conversation about Black Lives Matter, as we are beginning to look at our history, as we in Centers for Spiritual Living are offering small circles to look at, to explore the book Me and White Supremacy together, that we are looking at a system in our world, in our nation, that claims to be free, that has been creating a consciousness and creating systems and ways of doing and being that all of us have been participating in, that have been imprisoning and enslaving mass members of our communities, mass members of our society. And that in sort of our independent, Independence Day, our independent Americanized minds, we are told that we all have the power and the right to do and be as we want, that we all have the right to seek and express our freedom. And yet we have, in that sort of desire for independent and personal freedom, we have all been participating in systems of imprisonment and enslavement and oppression. And that this sort of balance of what is freedom and how does our individual freedom overlap and interact with the potential freedom or lack of freedom of others needs to come into our deep awareness of our definition of freedom. That we in Science of Mind have been so incredibly trained and cultivated and cultured to believe that our personal freedom is one of the qualities of God, that freedom is the nature of the universe, that freedom is who we are, that freedom is that indwelling presence that is seeking to express and emerge through each one of us, and that is in that freedom that we create our lives. And many of us in New Thought, our work is much in a similar modality or method of the self-help movement. That we are an extension of that, of the human potential movement, that we are saying that, it is my duty to cultivate myself and to look at my own individual freedoms and to express myself. And in doing so, we've also have the opportunity to become very self-centric, to become very self-centered, to become very, to perhaps begin to define our freedom as the one thing that is more important than anything else. And in some ways, our unintentional blindness, or the things that we're not aware of, it actually creates a space where our freedom begins to perhaps cause harm for others. I have a friend that spent some time in Ecuador working on an oil spill in the rainforest and working on some reclamation projects and trying to heal the jungle. And all of this, there's a long story involved in this, but all of the oil that is just in lakes in the ground, saturating this entire area of Ecuador, is a direct result of the West Coast shipping industry, that all of that oil is directly related to the shipping up and down the West Coast. And that any one of us who has used our privilege and freedom to go to the grocery store and buy the things that we want, or go to any place that sells things and purchase the luxury items and the things that make us feel good and the things that make us feel like we have freedom and spending power and the ability to be comfortable and find those little luxuries, any one of us that have participated in that, that is our oil. That spill, the cancer in the communities around those oil spills, are a direct result of something that I have defined as freedom, of my purchases, of the places that I've spent my money, of the fuel that I have burned driving my van. That all of those choices, those freedoms that I have sought for myself, have actually caused direct harm to someone else and an area of the planet that seems far removed from me, so I don't see it. And that we are moving into a world where there are certain actions and choices and awarenesses that we must begin to take, especially as people who claim to be spiritual and conscious, to become to be informed about what we are doing and how our choices impact not only ourselves but the others in the world and the world at large. Because if we want to see a world that works for all, we need to start by looking at who is all. And that's been the big conversation that continuously comes up as in the face of Black Lives Matter, people chant back this sort of argument of, well, all lives matter. And the problem with that is that we cannot claim freedom for all. We cannot claim the vision of a world that works for all until we are willing to look at the things that are not working, until we are willing to look at the systems that hold certain people from being included in that all that we are speaking of. And I've been thinking a lot that we at Centers for Spiritual Living have been claiming this vision for years of, we want to see a world that works for all, a world that works for everyone. And what I see emerging in the world right now, especially with the ripple effect of George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement and our collective conversation that we are beginning to engage in, is our actual willingness to look at what's not working, to look at the things that we have been perpetuating within ourselves, the things that we've been perpetuating in the world, even unconsciously. In pursuit of our own freedoms, we have been holding down the freedoms of other people. and that we must move to a higher ideal that allows us to recognize that freedom for all must actually be freedom for all, and that we have to look at the places where individuals and groups and communities have not been given the same freedoms as others. I was listening to a talk from Martin Luther King that I found on YouTube earlier this week, and this interview was 11 months before his assassination, and he was talking about the disparity in the granting of freedom to white people and black people in the United States, and that in when the after the Emancipation Proclamation came through and people of color were freed, he says at the same time the Midwest land grab was happening, and the government was giving white people land, acreage, opportunity, support, economic status, and people of color were given nothing. They were given freedom. And he said that we were given and these are Dr. King's words, I'm paraphrasing. He says we were given the freedom to hunger. We were given the freedom to starve. We were given the freedom to bear in the weather. We were given the freedom to struggle. And he goes, so in one sense we were given freedom, but we were also given famine. And he said, I am all willing to believe in the American ideal, that we should all strive at whatever level we can to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps and be independent, creative, free individuals. But he said that that is a cruel jest to say to a man who has no boots. And he said, metaphorically, the black man, when released from slavery, was given no boots. And that the American ideal was pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And he says, that's a cruel joke. And so we have this ideal of freedom that indeed our nation has proclaimed is who we are as American society. And yet, the systems in place, the culture that we have created as a nation, has never actually granted freedom for all. And so now we're having the opportunity to look at how do we fix that? How do we change that? How do we begin to unwrap and untangle our definitions of freedom and recognize where our freedoms have infringed on the rights of others, and even beyond that, where our freedoms are beginning to infringe more and more on our future as a collective, on the planet, on nature itself, on nations and peoples across the planet. That if we actually want to talk about freedom, we need to start taking our personal work, our inner self-reflective mental training that Science of Mind has given us, and begin to do our work in the collective mind, begin to participate in the collective thought that is taking place right now, and at whatever level we can, do our work to begin to unravel the systems of oppression that we have been participating in, that we have been supporting, that we have been engaging in. And to stop defining freedom as comfort, as personal luxury, as getting the things that we want, and start defining freedom as systems that support all people and that support all life and that support individuals and people of color and indigenous communities and women and transgendered people and the environment and the basic rights that individuals and communities need in order to be lifted up to a place where we can actually cultivate and experience freedom. Another definition of freedom that I found, and this is Merriam-Webster's definition, is that freedom is the absence of necessity, coercion, or constraint in choice or action. The absence of necessity, coercion, constraint in choice or action. And when I look at that definition, it's kind of startling to me. Because if freedom is the absence of necessity, coercion, or constraint in choice or action, then I believe that we have a bit of an issue, individually and as a culture. Because we are moving to a place where every choice and action that we make must be measured by the necessity, by its necessity, by its impact, by the layers and the ripples out from every choice and action that we make. And that we must not think of the absence of necessity now in a new way, in a new definition of freedom. That we must begin to look at the ripples, the impact of our choices. That we must be willing to think of freedom as participating in a web of interactions, in a web of experience that supports the highest and greatest outcome for all. And that we live in a world that, even if we just think about our political, if we think about the political situation, if you think about advertising, not one of us lives in a world that is free of coercion. And that every one of our choices are being moved in some way by outside forces. And that I think that it is incredibly important that we begin to practice constraint in our choices and actions. That we begin to enforce these things on ourselves and change, in a sense, the power structure of freedom. And begin to look at it not as something that is granted to us by something outside of ourselves, but something that we must engage in so that we may lift others up, so that we may support everyone in finding the highest level of freedom. But it must be about the collective. It must be about the greater good. That freedom must be more than just about me and what I want and my comforts and my luxuries and the things that make me feel free. That my new definition of freedom must include the well-being of all people. I was at a Buddhist retreat center a number of years ago, and they have these prayer candles that you can purchase, for a donation, and they'll be lit and prayed over. And they say whatever your prayer is, so these are metta prayer candles. And so whatever your prayer is, you need to word it in a way that includes the most possible beings. And so if you're sad, if you're experiencing a sadness and you're, praying for joy, or praying for a release of suffering, or praying for someone who has cancer, or the healing of a disease, or something like that, don't write your prayer for that one individual person or write it for yourself, but write that prayer for all people who are experiencing that thing. Because when we include all of those who are in a shared experience with us, that we begin to engage in that collective mind, in that collective idea, and that collective healing. And that when our prayers and our desires and our dreams and our definition is focused on ourselves, that we can only create at a certain level. And that we are actually, in a sense, creating unconsciously. And that we are creating based on the systems that surround us and based on the sort of influences that are coming from every direction. And that if we truly want to see a world that works for everyone, then it's up to each one of us to become centers of creation, centers of intentionality, places where we look at what it is that we want for ourselves and then balance that with the good of all and find a way to move forward that creates the greatest possible freedom for all of life. And that we have to be willing to look at ourselves in the mirror. We have to be willing to look at the world as a mirror. We have to be willing to look at everyone and everything that we see as part of ourselves, and to see ourselves as part of an interconnected web of all individuals, of all people, and of all life. And that every choice that any one of us makes, every action that we participate in, has a ripple effect that has an effect on someone else. And so now is the time for us to be engaged in a deep communal conversation about what is freedom. What does freedom for all look like? How do we lift up the people who we have been oppressing, either consciously or unconsciously? How do we create a level and even playing field? How do we create a creative opportunity and a new potential for a world that truly holds freedom as an ideal and as a value, and that it's not freedom of independence, but freedom of interdependence, freedom of interconnection, freedom of the recognition that we are all in this together. And so take a deep breath in. And if it's comfortable, close your eyes. And with me, just recognize and know that there is only one life. That this life is God. That this life is the infinite, seamlessly interwoven into everyone and everything. That it is this one that has been living and breathing the entirety of the universe throughout all time. That it is this one that spins the galaxies and shines the sun and orbits as the planet. It is this one that lives and breathes as everyone and everything who walks on this earth. It is this one who is living and breathing my body, who is speaking and hearing and living and being as me right now. And as I recognize this truth for myself, I recognize that every person who is hearing this, every person on this planet, every one of us is this self-same presence. Each one of us, the universe in miniature. Each one of us, God in form. Each one of us, the spirit of life manifest on this earth for the purpose of co-creation, for the purpose of bringing about greater freedom, for the purpose of the exploration of evolution, of life, of expansion, of connection, for the realization of oneness, for the evolution of consciousness. And so let us be in celebration that each one of us can be a place where evolution happens. Each one of us can be a place where evolution, where forward movement, where newness takes place. Each one of us can be a place where the universe sees its own reflection and begins to explore and untangle and recreate what is, so that we all collectively and individually intertwine our definitions of freedom, so that we move towards a world that works for everyone in every choice and in every action and in every interaction, in every thought, in every word. We paint the world that we want to see. And so let us participate in it from a level of awareness, from a level of consciousness, and from a level of creative choice. And so let us always remember that there is a power for good in this universe that is greater than we are, and it is ever and always seeking to express in, through, as, and for each and every one of us. And so let us surrender to this presence and let it move through us. Let us be moved by it. Let it move and wake and quake throughout the consciousness of humanity. Let it rise up and be who and what we are. And for this, and so much more, I am grateful. And so it is. Thank you, my friends.